newly constituted Legislative Apportionment Board, a state board existing under Title 17, Chapter 34A of the Vermont Statutes. We are meeting remotely using the Zoom technology platform, and I'm going to read into the record the reason and the authority for doing that. As chair of the board, I find that due to the state of emergency declared by Governor Scott as the result of the COVID-19 pandemic and pursuant to Act 92, this body is authorized to meet electronically. Further, in accordance with Act 92, there is no physical location to observe and listen contemporaneously to this meeting for members of the public. However, in accordance with the temporary amendments to the open meeting law, I can confirm that we are providing public access to the meeting by the Zoom platform, which includes an option of using a telephone. And all members of the Apportionment Board have the ability to communicate contemporaneously with each other during the meeting through the Zoom platform, and the public has likewise access to contemporaneously listen and, if desired, to participate in the meeting. Providing public notice of the instructions for accessing the meeting. We previously gave notice to the public of the necessary information for accessing the meeting on the public notice of the meeting posted on the Department of Libraries, and I believe on the Apportionment Board's page of the Secretary of State's website. In the event that anyone has a problem accessing this meeting, they should contact me at 802-238-4989. So I'd like to start out with an intro, according to the agenda that was posted, first ask if anybody on the board has any suggestions to change or possibly reorder the draft agenda. And you can either use the Zoom raise your hand function or wave your real hand. Seeing neither, I'm going to take the draft meeting agenda as the agenda and ask that each member in turn give a little introduction about him or herself. And I'll just start at the top of my screen the way I see it and ask Jeremy to unmute himself and introduce himself.
Hi there, I'm Jeremy Hansen. I'm from Berlin, formerly of the Berlin Select Board. I also teach computer science at Norwich University, and I'm the chair of CV Fiber, a communications union district here in central Vermont.
Jeremy, could you also, and I should have mentioned this before, just say, if you wish, anything additional to that about what interests you in the work of the Apportionment Board and what prompted you to get involved in this project?
Sure. So some of my research involves the nuts and bolts of elections from start to finish, and I've also been interested in the measurement of compactness in legislative districts. So as sort of the data and computer science and electoral machinery nerd, that this was interesting to me.
Thanks, Jeremy. Mary? Mary, you're still muted.
I'm muted. Okay, better?
Go. That's good.
Okay, from 1987 to 2007, I worked as the finance director at what was then the Burlington Community Land Trust, is now the Champlain Housing Trust. At that point, I moved to southern Vermont. I had lived in western Massachusetts before that, and southern Vermont has a similar feel, or at least the eastern corner does. and worked at the Brattleboro Housing Authority as finance director again for 10 years or 9 years until I retired, sort of retired. And since then, I've gone back to work a few times for money. And why I would want to do this, I'm an amateur nerd. So as a friend of mine said, I do love maps and I do love numbers. And it sort of fascinates me that this isn't already a computer program to at least come close. So that's why.
Okay, thank you, Mary. Susan?
You did.
There we go. I have a very long-standing interest in government, I guess, or the way government is organized. I was the vice chairman of Common Cause, the National Governing Board of Common Cause, many years ago, really when it first started, for about a decade or so, a little bit longer. And I got extremely interested in this, vexing problem of fairness, I guess. I was involved in lots of open meetings legislation, which I've sometimes come to be sorry about, but not mostly. And this, for me, is a terrific, so now I live in Bennington. I went to Bennington College, then did work with the Aspen Institute as Senior Energy Fellow there, and eventually ended up working mostly on venture capital investments for a small venture firm in a pretty wide-ranging set of things, from quantum computing to neuroscience. Really, it was a pretty interesting range. I'm now retired. I'm on the board at Bennington College. I was a founder there of the Center for the Advancement of Public Action, and I'm extremely interested in. I've been a little bit of a student of Professor Moon at Tufts from afar, who's worked on issues of gerrymandering and the application of various kinds of geometry, and I'll maybe leave that to Jeremy, but all of that stuff to this issue, but also understand that with all my love of computing, that really isn't enough, that there's a lot of human factor that is involved in figuring out what is most just and most representative, and I'm fascinated with that piece of the problem.
Thank you, Susan. Rob?
My name is Rob Roper. I'm currently the president of the Ethan Allen Institute. I've been involved in Vermont politics ever since I moved to the state 22 years ago, in a number of capacities as a lobbyist. I was chair of the Vermont Republican Party for 2 years, from 2007 to 2009. This is my second go around on the Reapportionment Committee. My interest in it is very similar to Susan's. There's the mathematical component to it, and there's a fairness component to it. There's a human component to it. There's a political component to it. To the extent we can get the politics out and have this map that we come up with really represent the best interests of the voters, I think that's the challenge we face, and that's the one that I want to take up.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Ed? Good morning.
Morning. Thank you, Tom. My name's Ed Adrian. I'm an attorney in Burlington, Vermont. I served on the Burlington City Council for about 5 years. I used to work for Chris Winters and with Betsy Rask. So it just goes to show you the size of the state. My appointment to this had nothing to do, as far as I know, with either of them. I am fascinated by the structure of legislative apportionment in Vermont, and the fact that we have any district that's larger than one is something that I'd love to discuss. I know that Tom had this discussion 10 years ago, but I know that that might not be where we ultimately end up. But for me, it seems like fundamental fairness that unless there's an extreme circumstance, having more than one representative or one senator per district simply doesn't make any sense to me. So I look forward to debate and the discussion, and I hear good things about everybody on this commission. So thank you.
Okay, Ed, and Tom Koch, good morning.
Good morning. Well, I'm happily retired after 40-year practice of law in Barrie. I spent 22 years in the legislature. I worked with some of the same people we're working with here. One of my projects back when in my first terms in the legislature was rewriting the election laws. There was a 150-page bill that I wrote myself when legislative council services were not what they are today. And we got 110 pages of it through in 1978, because the election laws back then, if you recall, were an absolute mess. So there have been a lot of changes since, but I've been interested in reapportionment for a long time. I wrote a paper on it in my senior year at Middlebury. I have to say the professors who reviewed it weren't that impressed, but so it goes. I'm interested in Ed's thinking about the single member districts. If we could accomplish that, I think it would be a good thing to do. But having seen it before, I know it's not easy. Multi-member districts make this job a lot easier to accomplish, but maybe we're up to the challenge of looking at single member districts. So looking forward to working with all of you.
Tom, is that senior thesis from Middlebury something you can post to the website?
No, I've long lost it. It may be on file. So no, I'm not sure it's even on file in Middlebury, but
Okay, well,
it wouldn't be of any help.
all right. Thanks for that. And Tom, I'm not sure everyone knows, you served in the House on two distinct and separate occasions. How many years did you serve the first go around?
I served 4. I got elected in 76 and 78, and then I took a 16-year vacation and came back for my third term in 96, and I declined to run again in 2014.
Okay.
But I'm still active, politically, and looking forward to this job.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, before you move on, may I interrupt for one moment?
Sure.
Did you want me to announce people as they were admitted into the meeting? We have a couple of, I think, public members who are joining, and I can just let them in.
I don't think we need to ask the names of the members of the public. If we get to public comment, that'll come up.
Okay.
I don't want to be intrusive on those who just want to sit back and watch and listen.
Very good.
Thank you. My background, my relevant background, that is that I chaired this board the last go around, serving with Rob Roper and five others. And previous to that, when I was a member of the Vermont House, I was in the House during the reapportionment sessions of 1992 and 2002. And as I was relating to someone yesterday, when I was in grammar school in Burlington in the mid-60s, one of the main focuses of the social studies curriculum in Vermont that particular year was the big causing reapportionment ordered by the courts that culminated in a special election in 1965. And that was my first exposure to the sort of the constitutional component of what the board is about. And I guess my curiosity and interest was piqued then, and that's still continues to this day. I know that I asked some of the board members, maybe all of them, to send me a written biographical summary or resume or CV. I think we'll want to finalize those, and it might make sense to post those on our website. So think about that, and I'll be reaching out to you again to, I think you can put as much into those as you wish. But I think it would be useful for those in Vermont who are following the work of the Apportionment Board to have a sense of the background of each of us that's easily accessible. That brings us to public comment. If there's anyone in the meeting who would like to comment on anything on the agenda, now would be the time to do that. So I know that there are 2 or perhaps 3 people listening in who are either from the public or possibly from the media. Does any of you wish to be heard during public comment? And there's no compulsion to. If you don't want to, that's perfectly okay. But if you do, you can unmute and identify yourself. Okay. Seeing none, we'll move on for the time being anyways. At the outset, I mentioned that either last night or early this morning, Betsy Ann Rath and Michael Chernick sent me and Chris Winters their reapportionment in Vermont PowerPoint slides that have been or will be posted on our website. I circulated those to the board members. Under this agenda item, I have overview of statutes, purposes, goals, and timeline of the board, and we're going to have Chris Winters, the Deputy Secretary of State, talk about the role of the Office of the Secretary of State, and then Betsy Ann Rath and Michael Chernick talk about, from the Office of Legislative Counsel, talk about the role of the Office of Legislative Counsel. A bit later on, John Adams for the Vermont Geographic Information Center is going to explain the resources that VGIC has for the board. And I think you'll be very interested and, if not excited, to hear about that. But for my introductory or overview piece, to prepare for that, I went back and read the minutes of the first meeting of the board from November 16, 2010. And I should add that available on our current website by a link, you can find all sorts of materials from the 2010-2011 version of the Legislative Apportionment Board. Maps, reports, other resources, and the minutes. And I found it useful to read over the minutes of the counterpart to this meeting from 10 years ago. I mentioned to that meeting, and I'll mention here, that the Apportionment Board is a public body subject to Vermont's open meeting and public records laws. I think it's our intention that each member of the board be assigned an email address that is a state of Vermont email address, so that for purposes of the overall record and public records requests, the communications that we do as board members would be in that, using those addresses. For me, if we can make progress today on some of our goals and our timeline, that would be, I would declare that a victory. We don't yet have, as we all know, the official US Census data, and we may not have that until the first quarter of 2021. John Adams is going to talk to us about the US Census data that we do have access to now. My own view, I can be persuaded otherwise, is that the board should not wait until getting the official US Census data before we start our real work, because that would be not putting the next 3 months to good use. And since we don't know when we're going to get that data, or whether there's going to be any controversy over it that might cast some doubt into its reliability, if we have good estimated data, it would seem to me to make sense to get started, and when the final data are in, to make adjustments accordingly. So we can talk when we get into a discussion about our meeting schedule, how often we should be meeting, whether we should be breaking down into any subcommittees or working groups. Giving a nod to what Ed Adrian mentioned concerning single member districts. The board, when it took its votes in 2011, did approve a House plan with 150 single member districts. That was a divided vote of the board, and I think I don't know whether we called it a minority report, but the board did issue or at least a minority of the board issued a counterpoint to that did not go with 150 single member districts. It's my own preference that we consider that as a sort of a both and arrangement. In other words, that if we can have a robust discussion about the wisdom of single member Senate and House districts, but also do the work that the board historically has done, which is to take a somewhat incremental approach and look at the existing districts where the population is such that the negative and positive deviations from the ideal sized district make those districts probably those that need some work from the board in order to get the overall deviation of the entire plans within reasonable limits. And I see no reason why we can't do both of those things. But we'll talk about that some more. As a heads up to Michael and Betsy Ann, I don't know that this board is required to hold public hearings per se during this early phase of our work. There does come a time when boards of civil authority have the right to call for public hearings in reaction to the tentative plan that the board has a deadline to propose by next summer. And there is a public hearing process that is triggered by that, following which the board issues a final proposal to the House. That public hearing requirement does not, I believe, apply to the Senate districts. But there may be some value and some wisdom to holding some public hearings around the state, if only to provide greater visibility to the work that we're doing, and in a time when the public's eye is clearly on issues around voting and elections and the integrity of the voter registration process and the mechanics of holding elections. With just to sort of tee up that later discussion about the incremental approach, I asked John Adams this morning if he could tell us, using the estimated census data from 2018 that he has been working with, how many House districts appear to now be at a 10% or higher deviation. And his answer was 33. And as a reminder, or as a bit of background, one of the ways an apportionment plan is evaluated or conceivably tested in the courts is to look at its overall deviation, which is calculated by taking the greatest negative deviation for any district and the greatest positive deviation for any district in the plan, and looking at the spread between the two of them. And the courts are somewhat reluctant about laying down hard and fast rules. But the last apportionment board's goal was to try to keep the overall deviation for both the Senate and the House plan below 20. And the more it is below 20, generally the better the plan is judged to be complying with the goal of substantially equal voting rights throughout the state. The courts, as I think we'll hear in a bit, do look at other factors, but the overall deviation is one of them. So that if we have 33 House districts that look like they're at 10% or higher, either negatively or positively, that would give us an overall deviation probably well above 20%. And there are 4 Senate districts who are likewise in the 10% or higher negative or positive deviation. So in the incremental approach that we take, there clearly will be some districts that will be our focus. And lastly, and Rob and the folks who are assisting us know this all too well, and we've over the years have tried to come up with metaphors to describe this. But if we decide that there's a House district in Rutland County that has a deviation problem, and we come up with a solution for that problem, either by moving a town into that district, or moving a town or 2 out and changing it from a 2-member district to a single-member district, or through some other arrangement, and we sit back and say, wow, we solved that problem. realized and will realize is that that's now adjusted the district lines to one or more adjoining district, and very likely have changed the deviation aspects of that district or those districts, requiring some work to be done on those boundary lines, and fixing them can often cause a ripple effect into even further districts. I'll stop there and take us back to the agenda and see if Chris Winters, you would like to introduce yourself and the Office of the Elections of the Secretary of State, and who we will be working with, and when those resources are going to be most available to us. Chris?
Thank you, Tom. I think I know just about everybody on here, and it's good to see a lot of your faces again. I am Chris Winters. I'm the Deputy Secretary of State. I've been in the Secretary of State's office over 20 years now, starting off as a staff attorney and Director of Professional Regulation, where I worked with Ed and with Betsy, and now Deputy Secretary for about 5 years now. And as you all may know, the Secretary of State's office has an administrative role to support this board. The Secretary of State is designated as the secretary of the board and has no vote. So we're here to give you the administrative support you need to do your work. I will likely be the one who's attending these meetings, but at some point it may be someone from our elections team, but they're a little busy with other things right now. So I'm stepping in to help support the board right now. The law also says that for administrative purposes, the board is part of the Secretary of State's office, and funds for the board's operation flow through the Secretary of State. Any expenditures are directed by the board, but flow through the Secretary of State's office. We have, hopefully you've all had a chance to take a peek at the website. We've put up an apportionment board portion on our website linked from our home page, and we'll take direction from the board as to what kind of content you want out there. And I'll just note that Mia Crow is also on the line right now in case you have any specific questions about the website, and so she can hear what kind of feedback you have about the website. As apportionment board members, you're entitled to a per diem that's set by statute. That's typically $50 a day plus expenses, which are usually meals and mileage, which I don't think we'll have much of that as an expense this time around, but that, that could change over the time that the board is working. And then minutes, I'll be taking minutes today. Whichever Secretary of State staff member steps in to do that later on, we'll take minutes. We'll make sure they get posted out to the website, and any other content that you want to put out there. As Tom mentioned, we're going to get each of you board members State of Vermont partner accounts. I think that's a best practice, and I've discussed that with Tom a little bit, so that your communications and your public records that are created as a result of the work of the board are more easily managed. I guess that's about it. I'm interested to hear what else you might think that the board needs from the Secretary of State's office in terms of support. But other than that, I plan to have a background role here and a support role either through me or through one of our elections team once the elections are over.
Chris, if we get to the point while the board is still doing its work that we can meet in person, if we choose to, do you have a conference room in your building that might be suitable?
I think that depends on whether we want to do a distanced, an appropriately physically distanced meeting. We don't have a conference room big enough, but if at some point in the future those terms change through the orders by the governor's office and recommendations from the Department of Health and the CDC, we have a conference room we could use, or we could arrange for a larger conference room that would accommodate that. We could figure that out.
I know that when we started out 10 years ago, we were in the old building.
Redstone.
But in Redstone, and by the time we finished, we were having our meetings on State Street.
Okay. Yeah, there are a number of large conference rooms in the Montpelier complex that I think we could take advantage of.
All right. Okay. Michael Chernick and Betsy Ann Rask, would you like to introduce yourselves and tell us what the role will be?
Why don't we start with Betsy?
Okay, hello everybody, good morning. My name is Betsy Ann Rask. I am an attorney in Legislative Counsel. We are the attorneys for the General Assembly, and this is going to be my second round of reapportionment. Go ahead, Michael.
Good morning, my name is Michael Chernick. I'm a colleague of Betsy's on the staff of the Legislative Council. And we, of course, this will be in part my fourth round working on this. So I've seen us go from semi-computerization and paper and pencil to almost total computerization in 2020. Our role with the Legislative Council, with the General Assembly, of course, is to advise the General Assembly and assist members and committees in a nonpartisan fashion as we go through this process. Our role with the Legislative Apportionment Board, beyond today's historic presentation, is not to provide staff services at all, but we are here to listen and to observe and to take mental notes and on occasion actual notes of information that we can then use as we do our jobs with the General Assembly subsequent to your deliberations.
Okay. Thank you, Betsy Ann and Michael. I had a couple of higher level questions that I would ask if you could address either now or in the course of your presentation on the sort of the history of apportionment, and they are something about the timeline. What is the deadline? What are the deadlines for the Apportionment Board to complete its work? And then something about the mapping software, who gets the license for that, who has access to it, and who can help the board with it. And Chris Winters, if you need to jump in on that, that's fine too. But the sort of the timeline for our work and when we'll have access to mapping software and who can help us with that.
Sure, I will be going through the timelines in the presentation that we prepared for you. Michael, do you want to give a status update on the mapping software?
I'd be delighted to. We have been discussing the mapping software, Betsy and myself and our IT team, for the last several weeks. About 2 weeks ago, we came to a decision that we're going to once again use the Maptitude software that we used in 2002 cycle and the 2011, 10, 11, 12 cycle. Our IT team has begun the contracting process. We expect to have it available for the LAB, approximately the middle of October is our best estimate right now. This is going to work a little bit differently than 10 years ago. There are not going to be individual, shall we say, physical licenses with software that we carry a disk around from person to person. Rather, we're going to have, as for now, 8 concurrent licenses, which means that it doesn't matter whether person A or person B is using a license at a particular time, as long as no more than 8 persons at any one time are on the system. And of course, that should work out fine during the LAB period. In terms of technical support, you'll be getting that through the Secretary of State, through MIA. What will happen though is that our IT person and persons, Duncan and Kevin, will probably give some initial assistance to Mia to get her going. And of course, John Adams will also be there for technical advice from the Geographic Information Center. And so that's how that works. So you'll have the same software that we have. In addition, beyond the concurrent license model, there is one other change. 10 years ago, in the end, when the LAB would be sending out reports to towns, to PCAs, you were sending those in large paper maps. That will not happen this time. We are purchasing a software package that will allow that information to go digitally on digital maps. We think in the long run, that's going to be much simpler for the towns, for the LAB, for Betsy and myself, and for members of the General Assembly. So we've moved forward in terms of technology on that score. And that's where we stand. And no doubt, Kevin or Duncan will be in touch with Mia and Tom once the software is actually available next month.
All right, thank you, Michael. So I am going to take us into the presentation that Michael and I put together. And we're still in the middle of session, so after this, I think I'm going to have to bow out and get back. The legislature is careening toward adjournment, and we're still doing our normal legislative work. So Michael, if that's okay, if you just want to stick around, I'll probably have to leave after this. But just to pick up on the role of legislative counsel, we are working for the General Assembly. We can't provide staff services to the Legislative Apportionment Board. We're very interested in your work. You help us to figure things out. You are going to be looking at the state and really getting into the nitty-gritty details of the state. And so you're taking the first look at how our population is shifting, and Michael and I will be very interested to follow you and see what you're doing as you propose how the state should be reapportioned. What Michael and I put together for you today is a presentation just to give you some background information to help you do this work. And so if it makes sense, I see that there is a presentation posted on your website. Thank you to Mia for posting that. But I think perhaps it would be helpful if I can just share screen. We can go through this document together, and then the document is there for you to go through. It contains hyperlinks, for example, to not only the Vermont Constitution, but also the reapportionment statutes, and then also some of the General Assembly's reapportionment pages. So I'm going to go into share screen. And I think it's going to mean that we're going to lose seeing each other for those of us looking at on video. But if someone just stop me, or perhaps the Deputy Secretary of State can stop me if there are any questions along the way. So, can you see this okay? All good?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So this is just an introduction for you. It provides introductory information for you as you do your work, because it's reapportionment time. It's very exciting. I'm very happy for all of you. This is such an important project for us. It happens just once a decade, and you are involved in a majorly important task for our state to have equal representation among our legislative districts, in accordance with the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. So where we're at right now with reapportionment is dramatically different from what was originally envisioned in the original Vermont Constitution, which was enacted in 1777. In that Constitution, and then in later law, Vermont had what was known as a one town, one vote for our House, and a county rule. In the House, which was created in the 1777 Vermont Constitution as a unicameral legislature, the Vermont Constitution provided each town with one representative annually and forever thereafter. That resulted in 246 representatives, one for each town, incorporated town. By 1785, the first Council of Censors, which was a body that could propose constitutional amendments, among other things, recognized this as unequal representation and proposed to amend the Vermont Constitution so that representation was apportioned by population. This was rejected. As a side note, the Council of Censors was a pretty hip group for its time. I also note in the early 1800s, it had recommended the ability for women to vote in the state, but that was also rejected. Things started to happen later on in our history. For the Senate, when the Senate was created in the Vermont Constitution in 1836, as its 30 members that it has today, each of Vermont's 14 counties received 1 senator, and the remaining senators were apportioned among the counties by population. And this ended up leading to inequality in representation. So by the early 1960s, the 38 residents of the town of Stratton had 1 representative, as did the over 35,000 residents of the city of Burlington, 1 to 1. And a House majority could be achieved by towns holding 9% of Vermont's population. Vermont's 22 largest towns were represented by less than 9% of the House members. And in the Senate, the 1 Grand Isle senator represented 2,927 residents, whereas in the 5-member Chittenden Senate District, there was 1 senator per 14,885 residents. I got this information either from one of our cases or from the Secretary of State's archives pages, which is another place that is neat to poke around in for more historical information. So this was happening throughout the country, and United States Supreme Court case law caught up. In the 1962 case, Baker v. Carr, the court held that legislative apportionment was not a political question that was exempt from judicial review. And in regard to the Supremacy Clause, in 1964, the case Reynolds v. Sims, the court held that where there is an unavoidable conflict between the federal and a state constitution, the Supremacy Clause, of course, controls and prevails. In Vermont, in early 1960s case law, our courts were picking up too. The U.S. District Court of Vermont held that both bodies of the General Assembly were malapportioned in contravention to the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and therefore unconstitutional and void. That was the 1964 case Buckley v. Hoff. The court said the House was grossly malapportioned. The citizens of the state's larger communities are invidiously discriminated against because of the inequality of representation. And in the Senate, it was impossible to apportion the Senate in any way that will not result in at least a 5-to-1 disparity between the largest and smallest number of people represented per senator. So Vermont went through this transition phase. The Buckley Court ordered the General Assembly to reapportion by July 1965. And so the General Assembly had to reapportion itself down from 246 members to 150 and reapportion both chambers based on population, and also created the Legislative Apportionment Board. And I think the chair was referring to what a change that was in 1965, where the General Assembly had to pare itself down from 246 to 150, from that town representation to representation based on people. It really changed Vermont. But it was necessary because constitutionally required. At a November 1965 special election, legislators were elected for 1-year terms, and then we returned to regular elections on 2-year terms beginning in 1966. But at the time, so Vermont was required to do this by the US Constitution. At the time, our Vermont Constitution was still under a 10-year time lock for amendments, so technically, the General Assembly was in violation of our own state constitution until reapportionment amendments were ratified in 1974. So part of this change in our amendments to our Constitution are set forth in Chapter 2, Section 73. This is the general reapportionment constitutional provision. It requires the General Assembly to establish the legislative districts. It requires it to do so at the biennial session following the taking of the decennial census under the authority of Congress. And it can also do so at other times the General Assembly finds necessary, and revise the boundaries of the districts and make a new apportionment of its membership in order to maintain equality of representation among the respective districts as nearly as is practicable. And the General Assembly was authorized to provide for establishment of a legislative apportionment board to advise and assist the General Assembly concerning legislative apportionment. It goes on to say that if the General Assembly fails to revise the legislative districts as required in this section, the Supreme Court, in appropriate legal proceedings brought for that purpose, may order reapportionment of the districts. So then statute did create the Legislative Apportionment Board. As you know, you're a 7-member board. The special master is designated by the Chief Justice and serves as chair. The statutory language provides that the governor appoints 1 member from each political party that has had more than 3 members serve as members of the legislature who are not all from the same county for at least 3 of the 5 bienniums since the last census. This is technically, in practice, works out to our 3 major political parties. And then each of those political parties appoints 1 member. LAB members have to be Vermont residents for at least 5 years, cannot be legislators or legislative staff. There is a separation between you and the legislative branch. You technically hold a 10-year term because you serve until your successors are appointed. I think it's probably the longest term in state government that's stated for a specified term. Secretary of State is secretary of the board, but has no vote, and you get your $50 per diem and reimbursement of expenses. That's the standard amounts in 32 VSA 1010.
Question, Betsy,
Hi, Representative Koch.
if I may. The bit about members who are not all from the same county, is that referring to members of the Legislative Apportionment Board or members of the, does that mean that, for example, the Republican Party needs to have members from at least 3 different counties in the legislature?
I think it's referring to the legislature. It is referring to the legislature. This language is a little tricky. If the General Assembly ever wants to revisit it, I think it could be cleaned up. It's been in this state for a while, but the language that the governor appoints a member from each political party that has had not more than 3 members serve as members of the ledge, and then says who are not all from the same county, is that yeah, I think that is the rub. Is it referring to legislatures? I think it's referring to legislatures. It's really not that clear. It would be nice if it could be cleaned up to make it absolutely crystal clear what it's referring to. This language has tripped me up before, but the last time it was amended was 2009.
Representative Koch, it's Michael Chernick. Hi. It's what I think Betsy and I might call a misplaced modifier. And she's right, it does get a little tricky, but we have read it as to mean the legislature, but it certainly could be cleaned up at some future date.
Right, it has no practical effect right now, but I was wondering what the intent was, and I guess I'm not the only one who was confused. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for catching that.
Betsy, this is Tom Little. I just would add maybe a footnote to your slide about what was going on in 1965. There were, I think, 3 separate lawsuits filed by different parties in 1965, each of which asked the courts, one was a federal case and 1 or 2 were state court cases, to stay the federal court's order requiring a special election so that the then legislature would serve a conventional 2-year session and no special election would be needed, and in 65. And it turns out in every case the courts denied the request for a stay, and that's why there was a they actually didn't meet the July 1 deadline for reapportioning, but they had a special election and then did it then.
Tom, it's Michael Chernick again. I could just add an interesting footnote I discovered the other day. Just before adjournment in 1965, after all was said and done, and there was no question there was going to be a 1965 election, the General Assembly adopted a joint resolution requesting the U.S. Supreme Court to let it stay in session until 1966 with the same members as one last try. But of course, as with the cases, it went nowhere.
All right, I'm going to keep going because I'm going to have to hustle up. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to rush a little bit, but I'll let you all talk after I go. I provided the slide or the site to your statutes, provide your powers in law. All of these hyperlinks should work in the document that I sent, but you have the sites here just in case they don't. So by statute, you are authorized to employ or contract for expert assistance or services or both. You can receive assistance from governmental entities for obtaining info regarding Vermont's population. And thank you to VCGI for the services you provided so far. Very helpful resource for all of the state. You can hold public hearings, and you can delegate your powers to one or more of your members or to investigators or hearing examiners in your employ.
Betsy, I got a quick question for you on
Hi,
that. All right.
Ed. I'm well. How are you?
I am curious, I talked to Tom a little bit about this when I was considering whether or not to accept this appointment, but I note that these powers don't mention what we actually end up doing. And I'll note that sections 13 and 18 of Chapter 2 of the Constitution delineate the number of House members and senators at 150 and 30. I'm wondering if it's within our mandate to suggest to the legislature that it reduce the number of House members and senators. I'm looking for a legal opinion on that.
I cannot give you a legal opinion, but
who would we get a legal opinion from? Do you know?
I mean, your staff services are the Secretary of State's office. I'd say there's nothing stopping you from making recommendations to the General Assembly. Like anybody can make recommendations to the General Assembly. So there would be nothing prohibiting you, I don't think, from discussing and making that recommendation. It is an issue relating to reapportionment.
Thank you.
So Vermont's LAB is designed to operate in an advisory capacity. There are different models of apportionment boards or redistricting boards throughout the country. It was interesting, I was just discussing with New York legislative staff. They, for the first time, will be going through redistricting, as they call it, with an apportionment board where the language of the recent, I think, constitutional enactment they have essentially gives their redistricting board three recommendations, 3 chances at recommendations before their General Assembly or their legislature can decide to do something different. Other states have models where the board itself is actually empowered to reapportion. The Vermont Constitution requires the General Assembly to reapportion legislative districts. So the Legislative Apportionment Board is advisory only. You submit your reapportionment proposals to the General Assembly. But the language of statute provides that the General Assembly shall then accept the proposal and enact it into law or substitute another plan for reapportionment, because by the Constitution, General Assembly has the ultimate responsibility for performing reapportionment. But you provide such a service because you are making recommendations, you are analyzing the state and its data, and you will get down into the nitty-gritty. If it's anything like last time, you will be submitting a report to the General Assembly with your proposals for both of the chambers, explaining your rationale, and as part of that, the LAB normally provides a report to the General Assembly that not only explains your overall rationale, but provides the details. Like, these towns are together, they share a school district, they share a solid waste district. These towns look like they're close together on a map, but without the topography, you can't see that there is a mountain running in between them, and you can't easily get from one town to the other. Your report can address how you may want to address one part of the state, but then, as I think the chair mentioned, as you try to address one area, it's like a domino effect with then moving populations in the other areas, and you'll get one map if you start at the top of the state and work your way down versus starting at the bottom of the state and working your way up, because every move you make in attempting to reapportion districts is going to cause a ripple effect. And so it is very helpful for you to do this analysis of the state and make your recommendations from a non-legislative perspective on what you think the population needs for its legislative districts. So you are very important in this, in your capacity and what you do for once a decade work. What you'll have to be considering are the reapportionment standards set forth in not only our Vermont Constitution, but also statute. So we already reviewed Chapter 2, Section 73 of the Vermont Constitution, which generally provides that the reapportionment of legislative districts is to maintain equality of representation among the districts as nearly as is practicable. In the House, the Constitution sets the House at 150 representatives, and it requires the General Assembly to establish 1 or 2 max for each district. The districts have to afford equality of representation and seek to maintain geographical compactness and contiguity and to adhere to boundaries of counties and other political subdivisions. For the Senate, in Chapter 2, Section 18, the Constitution establishes 30 senators. The General Assembly is required 1 or more senators for each district. There is not a maximum limit on the number of senators in a district. Vermont, with its 6 senators, has the highest number of senators in any district in the country. I think West Virginia is the closest, maybe with 3. The Senate district shall afford equality of representation and again seek to maintain geographical compactness and contiguity and adhere to boundaries of counties and other political subdivisions. I just provided a note down here at the bottom, a statutory requirement for both you and the General Assembly that this past year in 2019 in Act Number 2, the General Assembly did require the LAB to propose in 2022 Senate districts with a maximum of 3 members in each district, and provided in law that the General Assembly shall limit each senatorial district to a max of 3 members. So you are required to submit a plan for the Senate with not more than 3 members, even though the Constitution does not place a limit on the number of senatorial members.
Betsy, how did you guys square that?
What do you mean?
Well, it seems like you amended the Constitution without amending the Constitution.
Did not amend the Constitution. So thank you for pointing this out. It's something that I wanted to mention. This is, for the LAB, it does require you to submit that max of 3 members. It also provides in law that the General Assembly shall limit each senatorial district to a max of 3 members, but a statute cannot control a future General Assembly. The only thing that controls the legislature is a constitutional provision. So while this language does require the General Assembly in the next round of reapportionment to reapportion the Senate with a max of 3 members, it is theoretically possible for the General Assembly next year to essentially not withstand that statutory requirement and enact a Senate plan with more than 3 members. But they'd have to be, if they wanted to do so, they'd have to essentially be undoing what the last General Assembly, this current General Assembly provided should be the policy of the state.
Good to know.
Betsy Ann, just one quickie question.
Hi.
Hi. Am I right that the Senate has also taken up this question recently?
Yes, that was pursuant to 2019 Act Number 2. So that was just last year that requirement was enacted into law. So our standards for reapportionment are also set forth in law, in statutory law. In 17 VSA Chapter 34A, it's called periodic reapportionment. And it provides that reapportionment is based on population. If you noticed in those constitutional provisions, it doesn't say actually the basis of what the apportionment is. Statutes provides that it's on the basis of population, not legal voters, not others, any sort of other standard, but population of the state. As defined as the most recent census taken under congressional authority or a special census ordered to be taken by the General Assembly. Notably, I think perhaps you could consider in the last round of reapportionment that the General Assembly actually did have to update the work of the census after there were errors discovered in the area of UVM, where they actually said the census described that there was a number of population in a certain census block that turned out to be what, like a roundabout, Michael, or something like that. It was actually population was not where it was actually. And so the General Assembly had to work with UVM to actually find where the numbers in what census block they actually were. So
Just to add very quickly that we have had problems with the census twice in 2002 and 2012 with phantom dorms or incorrect dorm numbers. And Betsy and I have worked with the census over the last decade with the hopes, no guarantee, that that won't happen again.
Yes, thank you. Statute goes on to provide that the standard is to form districts with minimum percentage of deviation from the apportionment standard for each chamber, consistent with the following policies insofar as is practicable. 1, preservation of existing political subdivision lines. 2, recognition and maintenance of patterns of geography, social interaction, trade, political ties, and common interests. And 3, use of compact and contiguous territory. Specifically for the Senate, the statute provides that the LAB proposes apportioning the 30 senatorial seats among the counties or combination of counties with a maximum of 3 members in each proposed district, and in such manner as to achieve substantial equality in the choice of members as guaranteed by the Equal Protection Clause. And then the General Assembly shall then accept the proposal and enact it into law, or enact into law a substitute plan for reapportionment of the Senate that limits each senatorial district to a maximum of 3 members. As we discussed, the statutory requirement may be not withstood by the future General Assembly, but it would have to be going against this policy that this current General Assembly established in law for what it wanted to see moving forward. For the House is more difficult for both you and the General Assembly because there's so many members to work with. And so what happens in practice by statute is that you will prepare a tentative proposal, and if it appears that a town should be divided into 2 or more initial districts, or part of one town should be combined with part or all of another town to form an initial district, you notify the boards of civil authority of those towns. And then they can recommend to you the manner in which initial district lines should be drawn in accordance with those Section 1903 standards for reapportionment. And upon request of a board of civil authority, statute provides that an LAB designee shall call and preside without vote over a joint meeting of 2 or more boards of civil authority for the purpose of making joint recommendations. And then you consider those recommendations and you prepare a final proposal for how you propose to finally reapportion all of the House districts to a max of 1 and 2 members. Going on for what the General Assembly's duty is in the process, since House districts are constitutionally required to have 1 or 2 members, this statutory chapter establishes a process by which the legislature enacts initial districts that may contain more than 2 members, and then subsequently enacts a final plan to further subdivide multi-member districts to a maximum of 2 members. And this is how the statutes are also codified. You'll see if you look in the House reapportionment chapter, there is a statute listing initial districts, and then there's a separate statute providing how any initial districts are further subdivided to get down to that 1 and 2 member max. So after, process-wise, after the General Assembly enacts the initial districts, boards of civil authority of towns with at least 25% of the population in a multi-member district, initial district, can call a meeting of all the proposed initial districts BCAs to propose to the General Assembly a further subdivision, how that big district can be further subdivided into 1 and 2 members. Statute provides that the BCAs get 1 vote, but they are prohibited from proposing that a line be drawn through a town if that BCA objects. And it provides that BCAs have to consider preservation of existing political subdivision lines, recognition and maintenance of patterns of geography, social interaction, trade, political ties, and common interests. 3, use of compact and contiguous territory. And 4, incumbencies, statutorily required to consider those. So the main thing when we are looking at reapportionment and what the courts will look at are the deviations. That's how we know whether there is equality of representation as far as practicable. it's numbers. You're going to be working with census blocks that show the population in each census block, and you will have to work with those numbers as you decide how to reapportion the state, keeping in mind the deviations, because a court will look at the overall deviation to see if a reapportionment plan does not provide equality of representation. So first thing you have to do is figure out the ideal population. And that calculation is you take the state's overall population, the whole state population, which you'll get from the census numbers. You divide that by the number of members in the chamber, 150 for the House, 30 for the Senate. And then to figure out the ideal population for a district, you take that number and you times it by the number of members in a district. You'll get really used to working with these calculations, especially those of you that love math. Your fingers will just be, you'll just learn. You can do it in your sleep, how to do that calculation. It became very fun, just typing in the numbers. After you get the ideal population for a district, then you do a district deviation calculation. So you take the actual district population, the district that you propose, what is its actual population? You subtract the ideal district population and get your deviation. Then you take your deviation, divide it by the ideal population, times it by 100, that's your percentage deviation. And then what the courts look at is the overall state deviation, because this is going to how people are represented overall. Are they overrepresented or underrepresented? The overall state deviation, you take the highest high percentage deviation, who has the highest, who has the lowest, you add them together, and then you disregard the negative, and that's your overall deviation. It'll make more sense if you don't have it now, once you get into working with this. So just for a reference, here I provided Vermont's 2012 reapportionment statistics. Our 2010 population, according to the census, was 625,741 people. One congressional district, of course, we don't have to worry about reapportioning them. So with that 625,741 for the House, you see you have 150 members. So you take that 625,741, divide by 150, and then for each district, we have 1 and 2 members max in each House districts. So in 2012, the ideal population was 4,172 for a 1-member House district, and then double that for the 2-member districts, 8,344. That was the ideal population for 1 and 2-member House districts. The Senate, go through the same process. Take that whole state population, divide it by the 30 senators, and then times it by the number of members in a district. I crossed out 4 and 5 members because we don't have those. We have 1, 2, 3, and 6-member senatorial districts now, and you can see the populations there, the ideal populations for each of those, for Senate districts of that size, of those number of members. In the past, it is hard to, I think, reapportion Vermont with very low overall deviations, just due to our small size, our topography. Overall, in the past, the state has tried to stay below a 20% overall deviation. So we just gave you some recent overall deviations from 2012. What was finally enacted into law for the House was 18.9%. The Senate was 18%. And I also provided a link to you to our 2012 reapportionment page if you want to check out the maps there. In 2002, the House had an overall deviation of 18.86 and the Senate 14.73. You can find the actual House maps by clicking on those links that are provided. And then in 1992, Michael and I got this from case law that was mentioned. We don't have easy access right now to the deviations maps for 1992, but the court did mention in a Heartland case that the overall deviation for the House was 17.6 and Senate 16.4.
Betsy, quick constitutionality question for you or Michael. When we did this in Burlington last time around, we were told by the city attorney's office then that anything over a standard deviation of 10% essentially was constitutionally questionable. Can you speak to that?
I wonder if she was referring to an individual, the highest high deviation or lowest low deviation, because you add those together and get for example, if the max 10% and negative 10%, add those together is 20%. So maybe that's what she was referring to. Otherwise, I'm not sure. At least for the state overall, the state is shot for below 20%.
Okay.
I would concur with Betsy.
Ken Schatz was the attorney, was the city attorney at the time.
Oh, sorry, that one. Sorry. Okay. Here, finally, one of the questions that the chair asked at the beginning is the time frame. So I just did have this. This is based on statute and the Constitution. You have already met your July 1, 2020 deadline to be appointed. So now you have under a year to propose your plans for the Senate and House. By July 1, 2021, by statute, the LEAB has a deadline to prepare a tentative House proposal. And that's tentative because you're going to be getting the feedback from the BCAs. And you also, by that deadline, have to submit your final proposal to the Senate, for the Senate. So House is going to be more work because you have a month after you submit your tentative proposal to get the BCA feedback. By August 1, 2021, towns have a deadline to respond to you in regard to your tentative House proposal. And then you have 15 days after that to consider the town feedback and submit your final House proposal to the House by August 15th, 2021. And then what will happen?
So
oh, pardon,
Betsy,
yes.
Betsy, in referring back to the right of a Board of Civil Authority to ask a member of the Apportionment Board to convene a hearing, that all has, or July and before the 15th of August.
I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit.
Okay. If the boards of civil authority have certain rights.
Yes.
After the tentative House plan has been filed.
Mm-hmm.
But those rights have to be exercised in any of those hearings that be conducted before August 15th. So that's a tight turnaround.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
What will happen in practice? So by next summer, August 15th, you will have submitted your proposals for both chambers to the House and the Senate. And so what happens in practice is that sometime the chambers will have that late summer and fall to work with your proposal. On the House side, the last time around, the House Committee on Government Operations did a reapportionment roadshow that fall and winter to go around hearing from towns. On the Senate side, they created a special reapportionment committee. They will be considering and enacting a plan in the year 2022, the second year of the biennium, because they got your proposals at the end of after the end of the 2021 session, and they will be working with this to enact a plan in 2022. What happens in practice is, so the House, they have those initial districts where the first bill could be more than 2 members. They have the big districts. For example, the initial House plan for Burlington and the parts of Winooski, I think that had, what, the 10 or 11 members? You have to figure out how to further subdivide those districts, but the House will enact an initial House plan, and that happens usually in the middle of the 2022 legislative session, the second year of the biennium. And I just provided a link to the 2012 Act that was enacted at the end of February in 2012. That was the House's initial plan. And then by statute, it provides that as soon as practical thereafter, by April 1, 2022, BCAs can propose to the further House district subdivisions to get down to the max of 1 and 2 members, or even to subdivide a 2-member district down into 2 1-member districts. And then by the Constitution, it provides that by adjournment sine die, the very end of the biennium, that's the deadline by the Constitution for the General Assembly to enact the final House and Senate districts. And so I just provided a link to you from 2012 Act number 93, which enacted the final House and Senate districts.
A question for Chris Winters. Chris, when is the likely deadline for filing primary petitions? When does this, as a practical matter, have to be done in 2022 in order to accommodate the primary process kickoff?
I don't know that off the top of my head, Tom, but I can ask.
Tom, I had looked, if I may, it's Michael Chernick. I had looked that up. Pursuant to statutory law, the beginning of the filing period in 2022 will be on the 4th Monday in April, and then it proceeds through the 4th Thursday in May after the 1st Monday in May.
So that's a sort of
It's tighter than 10 years ago, yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Michael. And that was it. Just wanted to say thank you and good luck to all of you in working on this constitutionally vital decennial project. It's vital to our state, it's vital to representation, and just wish you all the best. Thanks.
Thanks.
Good luck. Good luck with the rest of the session.
Thank you very much. Michael, you
Thanks,
can pick
Betsy.
up and fill in any other details. I'm going to have to bow out, I think, but thank
Here
you
for the
all. Nice to
balance
see you all.
portion.
Thank you.
Good luck, Betsy.
Thanks.
I'm wondering, Michael, you may be the best situated to describe at a reasonably middle to high level how the Maptitude software works. How, you know, if you find a district where you think you've got a population deviation problem, how do we use Maptitude to help solve that problem?
Okay, the Maptitude would allow us to put in the deviation of a particular district and then to calculate out what the impact would be statewide. It allows us to create with different census blocks. We can change a district around within the software, change census blocks, which serve as our base unit. And we can find out what that deviation change would be. For example, if we take out block 215 and put in block 216, that type of thing. That will also give us that. And again, as I said, it will also give us the statewide deviation as a result of any change that we make. So we do not have to be doing that by pen and paper the way we were as recently as 1992 to some extent.
Michael, I got a quick question if I can, Mr. Chair. Hope you've been hiking. I want to follow up on the question that I asked Betsy, which is, and so there's the I don't know if mean is the right word, but you know, the division of all the districts out, so you get that number of what the ideal district should be, okay?
Correct.
My understanding, again, based on what Ken Schatz told the Burlington City Council at the time, was that it was constitutionally infirm, although not completely clear, but still concerning if there was greater than a 10% standard deviation.
I'm going to repeat what Betsy said.
Yeah.
Is that, and again, I can't give you a legal opinion.
Sure.
But what Betsy speculated, and I'm going to speculate as well, that you were being told that with respect to a single district. And I should reiterate what Betsy said earlier, that our 20% is looking at the complete mathematical spectrum, the 10% below, the 10% above. So that would
okay, that's what I didn't understand. I got it now. Thanks.
Yeah, that's the concept of the overall deviation for the entire.
Right, as opposed to an
map.
individual. You're absolutely correct that whenever we see a deviation over 10% on our side of a specific district, Betsy and I become very concerned, extremely concerned. So there you go.
I think we've discussed, we've covered briefly the next agenda item, which is open meeting and public records laws. We are subject to both. I'm going to be sending around or posting a link to a webinar that the Vermont League of Cities and Towns offers, not about apportionment per se, but about how public bodies can comply with the open meeting laws in the context of the COVID-19 restrictions on meeting in person. And you can take a look at that if you like for a little education on that. But the records that each of us generate and that the board itself generates are generally public records and must be preserved. And we can get into more detail about that if we need to later on, about preserved for how long or where they get preserved, but more to come on that. We have a segment on the agenda now for John Adams from the Geographic Information Center to explain what they do in this area, what they've already done, and perhaps a little bit about what he reasonably expects to receive and when from the U.S. Census. John, you have the floor. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. And I'll share my screen, and I also, in the chat box, just put a link to what I'm going to share here. And it's at lab.mapvt.com, but we can have it linked on the Secretary of State's page, or even embed some of these items there if that makes more sense. So Tom had asked me to pull together some of the latest estimates in terms of population for the House and Senate districts to help the board get a sense of maybe the work ahead of them or where things stood. So we've put together this page, think of it as a landing page for some of these different maps, charts, and data, and we can update these or change them as needed, as if any board members think that would be useful. I'll walk you through the maps and visuals here. I'll maybe start with just a few notes on the methodology for where these estimates came from. Currently, we have the 2018 American Community Survey census population estimates for these geographies. We also took 2020 estimates from Esri, which is a mapping software company that did create a composite based on a number of other ones, and then averaged out the 2018 and 2020 ones to create a composite, or what's represented as the 2019 population estimate. So if you see a 2019 population estimate or reference to a composite one, that's what those numbers are referring to. There are some methodology notes down at the bottom, as well as links to the tables if anyone would like to see all of those numbers and the field definitions there. So it gives you the American Community Survey estimates, as well as the Esri ones, and the calculation, as well as the calculation for the different deviations. So here at the top, if you select either of the maps, it'll take you to a map of the districts, as well as the absolute deviation in terms of absolute numbers based on those 2019 estimates. And you can select any of those districts, and you'll get a little bit of additional information, like how many members are there.
And John, just to be clear, what we're looking at now is the Senate district map. It sort of looks like the county map, but it's not the county map. These are the Senate districts, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
So these are the Senate districts. I did include, you'll see the county outlines.
John, I'm sorry. This is Adrian. Where are these located? Like, where do they live right now on the internet?
So if you go to, in the chat box, I posted a link to lab.mapvt.com.
Okay. Got it.
And then from there, just select one of the maps and it'll take you to this interactive map. And you'll notice I included the town boundaries as well as part of the base map. But if there are any other features you'd like me to include, happy to do that.
When you scroll over those towns, does the town name of the town pops up? Name of the town pops up. Good.
Right. When you zoom in, those will pop up.
So this is giving the overall population numbers above or below the ideal for a Senate district, but it doesn't convert those to percentage deviations yet.
You'll notice the number down at the bottom for the pop-up has the percentage. If the board will be working more in terms of percentage as opposed to these absolute numbers, it wouldn't be very hard for us to just change these, the symbology to be colored in terms of, 0, 5, 10%, if that's more helpful. And then this is the same for the House districts. I did include for the House districts, if you do zoom in, you'll notice the actual 2010 census blocks come up. Those are those red lines. So if you select those, you can get the numbers for those blocks. So you'll see 691 in that block there.
Back to, what is it, Chittenden 7, the House district you had there, John. Was Chittenden 7? Yeah, I'm not looking for the census. Okay, it's 7-1. So that's a single member district with the latest estimated population, changed since 2010, deviation from ideal, and the percentage, which means that's a plus 12%.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. It's helpful.
And the symbology here of over 1,500 to 1,000, these I selected arbitrarily as just round numbers, but if the board has, again, would prefer to have this symbolized as a percentage, or there are specific numbers you'd prefer me to use, it would be fairly simple to change those over. So those are the two maps we've created here that you have access to. Another note about the methodology while I'm thinking about it. So the census is taken, looks at where people live on April 1st. which will be interesting for this census related to the pandemic, but also the 2020 census, the 2020 population estimates from ESRI, the composite estimate we used, has estimates for July 1st. So we averaged it out with the 2018, which are April ones. But when you're looking at a district that has a student population, keep in mind that there could be a greater degree of variation there because the 2020 estimate looking at July may or may not include those students.
John or Michael, do you think can we assume that when we start getting Maptitude online, that it is going to be using some similar or comparable census estimates for the time being?
I would not, I could look into that for you, Tom, but I would not guarantee it. It may be relying exclusively on the last census. I can tell you that Betsy and I specifically asked John at your request and our own interest to include more recent estimates, which of course is very helpful for right now. But I'm not sure about the Maptitude. I can certainly make that inquiry.
Yeah, please do. Thank you.
A few other sort of interactive charts we've included here is a chart of the distribution of the district house populations. If you hover over, it'll tell you what the deviation is, and again, in terms of numbers, and the colors represent whether or not a district has one or two members. I've also included a table here that has all of the house districts. It shows you how many numbers it has, the 2010 to 2019 population. You may notice in the center of the sort of line chart here, the trajectory may go up or down. So this represents the 5-year ACS population estimate, and then the composite one at the end. So you can see here how they might differ a little bit. And then you have the absolute population change, and then deviation from ideal. So you might notice in some places you might have an expected or a population loss, but it's still positive in terms of deviation from ideal. And that's because essentially the existing deviation might be greater. So just a note there that the population change is different than the deviation. And you can sort, if you just select there, it'll sort by the greatest amount of deviation, positive or negative. And then the final column here is just represented as a percentage. And then for the Senate charts, created a slightly different one here since we have far fewer. This shows you in the blue is where we were in 2010, and the yellow with the population estimate in 2019 shows you the change in number of, so this is represented in terms of the change in number of senators needed for equal representation. So it sort of flips it on its head, and the estimated ideal population here is 21,164 per senator. So one represents essentially that 21,000 in terms of population, and it shows you where the different districts are with regards to the latest population estimate.
Well, set of census numbers are we eventually going to be working with, and when do we expect them to be available?
That's a great question. You would be expected to use the 2020 decennial census numbers, so the actual census numbers. As to when those will be available, that has been a moving target. One of the more recent release dates that I have heard has been pushed back to June 17th, so a 6-week period beginning June 17th. Now, if that's the case, that would be could be particularly problematic for the board given the existing timeline or schedule. So that's something to, I think, look into a little closer and get some clarity as to when that final date is expected and whether or not any changes to the board schedule should be considered, or if they're even possible.
Tom, may I jump in for just a second on that
yes, Michael.
score? Statutorily, of course, the board has to ultimately rely on the final data. When that becomes available, Tom, is going to be, I think, dependent on the judicial proceedings, federal judicial proceedings that are happening out in California right now, where there was a challenge to the reimposition of the statutory date, and the administration was appealing that. And I would not be surprised if that goes up to the Supreme Court. So we'll just have to wait and see how that turns out. And once there's a final judicial decision, then the census can proceed. If it turns out that the data is going to be into the spring sometime, beyond that March 31 deadline, which is the statutory deadline for the legislatively required data, then the General Assembly would have to make a decision next session as to whether to move the dates for the 2021 reporting.
Right. Thank you, Michael. Anything else, John?
This other table is simply the same as the House one above, but for the Senate. The one other item I'll note, you'll notice a tab here on differential privacy. So that's something I just thought would be useful to highlight for the board, and something you may want to familiarize yourself with. So I've included here a little bit of an explanation of differential privacy, as well as some helpful links at the bottom explaining what differential privacy is. So for the 2020 census, and this is different than any other previous census, the current plans are to release the census data with a privacy algorithm applied to it at different geographies. So you can think of it as they'll essentially be scrambling the data at the smaller geographies, which could have some impacts in terms of what that looks like, what the real actual numbers are, and what we'll be getting in terms of census numbers. For most states, this isn't going to be an issue. For Vermont and New Hampshire, we're a little unique in that we have we have a lot of legislators representing very small populations. So what I've done here is taken the latest, they've run the algorithm on the 2010 census to give us a sense of how different things might look. So here you'd notice I've broken it out by district and by, these are the different census tables. So if you look at total population, they might be reporting out the actual number, might be 8,763, but they may be reporting out 8,639. And I think the biggest discrepancy here was about 6.7% change from the actual and what's reporting out. So I don't think that the any final decisions have made on how they're going to do this or what exactly the equation is going to be. But I thought it was worth bringing up and at least having the board be aware of it should it come up, and thought this tool might be helpful in understanding or visualizing what that looks like. I had done it for town populations, so you can ignore this bar here that filters by town population. That won't work for the legislative districts.
Thank you, John.
Mm-hmm.
I know that what John has given to us is a fertile ground for questions and discussions, but I think we're going to defer that for the time being to try to get through the rest of the agenda. The next item of which is, what do we think our schedule should be for board meetings? And I would add, I'd say for the next 3 or 4 months. Do we, and that might include a Maptitude training session when Maptitude becomes available. It could involve a deeper dive with John, a deeper dive over the discussion about single member districts and the incremental approach. It could involve identifying districts that look like they're going to need boundary changes in terms of their deviation. We could set up a series of monthly meetings for October, November, and December and see how that goes, together with or without some subcommittees that we could set up to work more intensively on some of these issues. Any particular thoughts or advice about that from the board members?
Well, Tom, you've been through this before. I would just as soon leave it to you to decide what we need, and then when you think we need a meeting, you go through the pain of trying to schedule something we can all attend.
Okay. Susan, did you have a comment?
Well, I don't know about the rest of you, but Zoom has sort of taken over, and it would be really helpful to me if we had, even if we then abandoned it because it wasn't needed, but if we had at least some initially scheduled meetings over the next 3 months, it would be terrific to know.
Yeah. Rob?
Yeah, I think what you outlined makes a lot of sense. Until the data starts coming in and the technology starts becoming available, maybe start out with some more philosophical conversations, such as the single member district, and then the problem districts, looking at the map where we think we might see issues might be a good next step. And then when Maptitude becomes available, then we can start incorporating those two conversations into the actual technology.
Okay, that's helpful. Jeremy?
So I'd like to echo what Susan said. I think having a schedule a couple months out so that we can plan for it, for me, that'll be very helpful. I'd like to be able to put it on my calendar and be able to work around that rather than trying to fit it into my already crazy schedule.
Okay. Well, I think I agree wholeheartedly. I was a burr in the saddle of the appointing authorities for this board starting at least 6 months ago, trying to get the board members appointed sooner rather than later. Last 10 years ago, the first meeting of this group was in the middle of November, and I would hate to think that we would have managed to start our work in September and not do anything. because I think there's plenty to be done, if only in terms of getting board members up to speed and comfortable with technology and the history and our goals. So I will work with Chris Winters and others to set up some meetings and some proposed agendas with that in mind. The website is up. Please play around with it and let me know if you think there's additional content that you would like to see there, or if you're having any difficulty accessing it. There was mention earlier on by Chris of the additional materials that are in the state archives, and perhaps Chris, you could say something about how we look for stuff in the archives if we decide we need to, or should we just check with you about that?
Tom, I think if there's something specific you're looking for, anyone can reach out directly to me. I can put you in touch with the archives folks. There's a lot of information that's on the 2010 website, but if you're looking to go beyond that, we have people in our reference room who are standing by willing to help you out with that. One other question that I did have about the website that we had discussed briefly, Tom, was how comfortable people are with putting the board members are with putting their contact information out there. To what extent do you want contact information out there? It could be as simple as an email address, or we could go more extensively with phone numbers and physical addresses or mailing addresses. But the typical practice is not to put everything out there. Protect your privacy a little bit more than that, but it's really up to the board how much information you want out there for each individual board member.
Well, perhaps we'll leave it that our newly assigned email addresses will be the sort of the default minimum, and any board member who wants to put in a mailing address or a phone number or a website can do so. Anyone? Okay. I'm mindful that I know at least two people on the board have a pretty hard stop at 11. So one of the things I'd like to commit to you all is to starting the meetings on time and finishing them on time. I know that has a great influence on enthusiasm for the next meeting. So I'm going to try to abide by that. For other business, I've got a list of things that we're going to look at, possibly subcommittees or working group, streaming these meetings live on YouTube for a wider audience, Maptitude training, additional public outreach. We haven't really talked about that, but I think it would behoove us to do a public outreach to let people know that who we are and what we're doing. I have done some outreach myself to leadership in the General Assembly, just to let them know that today was our first meeting and I sent them the agenda. And I've also let some of them know that depending upon the timing of the receipt of the US Census official data, it's conceivable that the General Assembly may need to take action early in the next session and to provide some flexibility to the deadlines that are currently in statute. Any other last thoughts or comments about our work?
Tom, I got a couple of things, if it's okay. One is I'd love to see your face. I don't know if that's a reception issue for you. I don't know.
I guess I have it as turned on, Ed, so I'll look into that. Okay. The other thing is, and I just want to plant the seed since it sounds like we're going to be discussing philosophy, and I think I broached it quickly with Betsy. I really do believe the Vermont legislature is too big. There's 150 reps and 30 senators. Just really quickly,
The country of Iceland has 63 legislators and a unicameral legislature. The economy of Iceland is about the same as Vermont. I think that something that I'd like folks to seriously think about if we're going to be talking about philosophy is reducing the size of the legislature, 60 reps, 20 senators. It does two things. One, it creates smaller government, which I think some people here are advocating for. And I think it also creates more equitable government because it would then allow the salaries of those reps and senators to be tripled if the budget was kept the same. So that's my pitch for something to think about. I know it's a pie in the sky, but still good to have the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Ed. And I have to say, I thought you could see my face the entire time, so I'm disappointed as well. Anyone else for the good of the work of the board? Thank you so much for your commitment to doing this work. It's going to be a very interesting 9 plus or minus months, intensive at times, but I think it's a wonderful opportunity for us to keep Vermont on track in terms of equal representation in the General Assembly. Thanks, Chris, for your help, and for Mia and everyone else on the Elections and Secretary of State's team, and Michael Chernick. Give again our regards and thanks to Betsy. That was a great presentation. If not, anything more, we will stand in adjournment, and you will be hearing from me. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Great, thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.